Thank you, Emer, and thanks for the festival for inviting me, and thank you for coming. This novel, The Magician, is about the life of the German novelist Thomas Mann. He was born in Lübeck in the north of Germany. It's a city near Hamburg in 1875, and he died in Switzerland in 1955 at the age of 80. Himself and his brother, his older brother Heinrich, who was also a novelist, they often wondered how come, because all the commercial families in Lübeck, how come their family produced the two writers and other commercial families in Lübeck not only didn't, but didn't dream of doing such a thing. And the reason they gave was their father's marriage, who their mother was, that their mother was born in Brazil. And I actually went to the house where she was born in a place called Paraty, which is on an inlet. And it's a big house on the water. It's more or less closed up now. But I was with someone who could explain to me that in the southern hemisphere, that if you're on an inlet like that, at night the stars really shine onto the water because the water is calm. And that if you're in an upstairs room in a house like that, you really need thick shutters because the light from the stars onto the water reflects into the room almost like sunlight. You could read by such light. And it really made me wonder when this woman, Julia, Thomas Mann's mother, was brought back as a young girl from Brazil, or she was brought for the first time from Brazil to Lübeck, what it would have meant to her, what it would have looked like on that, say, first night. Her father was German. In other words, Thomas Mann's grandfather on his mother's side was German, but his grandmother on his mother's side was Brazilian, by which I mean that she was of mixed blood. And so you can imagine in this very conservative Protestant city in the north of Germany, the arrival of such a person, what it would have meant in this city, not only this city that was very conservative. Some people were so concerned about her presence that they really thought she might even be a Catholic. But that turned out, in fact, not to be true. And of course, the reason for the journey was that Lübeck, even to this day, is the center of marzipan making in Germany. And there's a big, anyone who ever orders marzipan or eats marzipan, it's from Lübeck, which means that all the sugar comes from Brazil, so that trade, that bringing the sugar, also brought Thomas Mann's mother to Lübeck. And she was younger than his father, who was a very conservative senator from a family that went back generations of traders in Lübeck. And so she married him and produced the first two sons, became famous writers. I just want to start with a small bit describing the mother. This is his mother. And there's a party in the house, and the children are watching as the mother gets ready to go downstairs. His mother waited upstairs while the servants took coats and scarves and hats from the guests. Until everyone had been ushered into the drawing room, Julia Mann remained in her bedroom. Thomas and his older brother Heinrich and their sister Lula and Carla watched from the first landing. Soon they knew their mother would be told to go to bed. Soon they knew their mother would appear. Heinrich had to warn Carla to be quiet or they would be told to go to bed and would miss the moment. With her hair pinned back severely and tied in a coloured bow, Julia stepped out from her bedroom. Her dress was white and her black shoes, ordered specially from Mallorca, were simple, like a dancer's shoes. She joined the company with an air of reluctance, giving the impression that she had just now been alone with herself in a place more interesting than festive Lübeck. And so this is a description, of her coming into the party. In the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, what they were like, or what languages they spoke. A country many, many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter, and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reached back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did, and they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty was on the water, Julia would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they're visible like the sun during the day. They are small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said she could read a book in the upstairs rooms at night because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. You could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about the ship. No, you must go to sleep. Tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar, but just a small part again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they are eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? You must ask your father that. And this world was destroyed when Thomas Mann was in his early teens, when his father died. And his father wrote one of those punitive wills that said the family business was to be wound up, the one that had been there for generations. And he put guardians in charge of his children and his wife. And his wife, almost in retaliation, decided to move to Munich, which, was very, if we think that this is happening in around 1890, and German unification occurred in 1871. So Munich is really very far away in everyone's mind. I mean, it doesn't just have Catholics. It has Jewish people. It has nuns on the street. It has Bavaria at the other side of it. So it was a very big move. And Thomas Mann he was a little prince on the streets of Lübeck. Everyone knew who he was. And now in Munich, he was nobody. And that gap, that distance between what was totally familiar and what was lost, it nourished his first novel, which is called Buddenbrooks. And that big novel reconstructed the world of his family in Lübeck, going back 4 generations. And it brought as though the intensity of the loss was matched by the intensity of the detail in which he described his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and indeed his own parents, and indeed his own presence in the world. And that novel, which he finished at the age of 25 in 1900, was published the following year and made him a famous young writer in Munich. And if you go to the museum in Lübeck now, what you see is there's a painting, and it's of 5 children, and they're dressed as sort of clowns in sort of circus costume. They were the Pringsheim children living in Munich. They were from a very rich family, and they were sort of famous for being famous, as it were. And Thomas Mann saw this painting reproduced in a magazine, and he cut it out and he had it on the wall like you would a sports star or a rock star. 10 years later, when he's in Munich, in fact, 15 years later when he's in Munich, he sees these children, but they're grown up now. And they notice him. I mean, I'm talking about going to concerts, going to plays. He would see them. And they noticed him because he was a famous writer, a young writer, and he noticed them because of the picture. And so he finally gets invited to their house. They're tremendously rich. The daughter, Katja, who's about 20 at this point, is one of the early women to study science in a German university. The father is a professor of mathematics. The family is friendly with for example, with Mahler. They have invested money in the concert hall in Bayreuth for Wagner. They were very close to the Wagners. So they're a great bohemian, assimilated Jewish family living in Munich. And really, he's a provincial from the north of Germany. He's out of his depth with these people. But he manages to get invited to the party. And Katya's brother is called Klaus. Oh, and the young hero in Buddenbrooks is called Hanno, who's a version of Thomas Mann himself. So there's a mention of Hanno here. There were, he guessed, more than 100 people at the Pringsheim supper. The first one he attended, with tables spread over several of the reception rooms. Most of these rooms had carved ceilings and inlaid paintings and murals. No surface was undecorated. He arrived accompanied by the nervous young poet who had got him the invitation, and the poet's aunt, the painter, who wore many glittering jewels around her neck and in her hair. The Pringsheim boys, especially Klaus and Peter, are a lesson to the youth of Munich, the aunt said. They're refined and civilized. They had already achieved such a great deal. Thomas wanted to ask her precisely what they had achieved, but as soon as they had handed over their coats, she moved away from them, leaving the two young men to linger in the shadows watching the scene. A few times he caught Katya Pringsheim's eye. Katya, just to emphasize, is the only daughter in this family. And while she seemed amused at his presence, she did not acknowledge him directly. Once supper was over, he asked his friend to introduce him to Katya and Klaus, her twin brother, who were standing in the doorway having an intense conversation. He could see Katya smiling as she interrupted her brother, putting her finger to his lips to stop him speaking. Although they must have been conscious that Thomas and the poet were approaching, they did not turn. The poet reached out and touched Klaus's shoulder. As Klaus looked at him, Thomas saw how beautiful he was. He almost understood why Klaus did not frequent the cafes. He would have been singled out and stared at. His politeness, the understatement in his tone, the neatness of his dress would have stood apart from the abrasiveness and the shabbiness then in vogue. Thomas, aware that Katya was watching him as he took in her brother, directed his full attention to her. Her eyes were the same deep, dark colour as her brother's. Her skin was even softer. Her gaze was unembarrassed. Your book is much admired in this house, Klaus said. In fact, we all fell out because one of us hid the second volume. Katya stretched lazily. He could see the boyish strength in her body. I will not mention the culprit, Klaus went on. My brother is tedious, Katya said. We call you Hanno, Klaus said. Some of us do, Katya said. We all do, even my mother, who hasn't finished the book. Yes, she has finished it. As of 2 p.m. today, she had not finished it. I told her the end, Katya said. My sister spoils things for people. She told me the end of Die Walküre. My father had already told us, and I was worried he'd find out that you hadn't been listening. Our brother Heinz told us the end of the Bible, Klaus said. And it ruined everything. That was in fact Peter, because he's horrible. Our father has to ban him from gatherings. My sister, Klaus said, spends her life listening to our father. She actually studies with him. Thomas looked from one to the other. Their conversation, he sensed, was an underhand way of laughing at him, or at least excluding him and his companion. He knew that on arriving home, he would remember every word they said. When he had cut out the portrait of the young Prinsheims from that magazine, this was what he had imagined. A world filled with elegant people and rich interiors, with conversations going on that were both clever and oddly inconsequential. He did not mind that the decor was perhaps too rich, and that some of the people were too effusive. He minded nothing, as long as these two young people continued to allow him to listen to them and watch them. Oh no, Katya said, my mother, look, she's being held in a vice-like grip by that woman whose husband plays the viola. Why was she invited, Klaus asked. Because you or my father or Mahler or someone admires how her husband plays the viola. My father knows nothing about the viola. My grandmother thinks there should be a ban on any woman marrying, Katya said. Imagine how different these rooms would be if people had only listened to her. My grandmother is Hedwig Dom, Klaus said to Thomas, as though he were confiding in him. She is very advanced. As they left the house, the young poet told Thomas that he'd asked his aunt if the Prinsheims were Jewish. What did they say? Thomas asked. They used to be. On both sides, but not anymore. They're Protestants now, even though they seem very Jewish. I mean, Jewish in a grand way. They converted. No, my aunt says they assimilated. So Thomas Mann, even though, as we can see there, his homosexuality is quite apparent to Katya, actually agrees to marry him. when there's a mention of her grandmother was indeed very advanced. And in this book, her grandmother says that she's totally and utterly in favor of homosexuality for men. She thinks it's the most marvelous thing, because if all men could get involved with each other, then they would leave women alone. And that she thought that would be a great moment for mankind. And they have 4 children. And eventually, Katia, in 1913, is diagnosed with tuberculosis. And there's a moment when she's in the sanatorium in Davos in Switzerland, and Thomas writes to her to say, these children of ours, they've really changed. She writes back to say, no, they've been like that for some time, just you haven't noticed. But now you're on your own with them. You're going to actually, experience them, because previously he was involved with his work and he was in his study. So we know in 1924, Thomas Mann published his novel, The Magic Mountain, which it describes a young man who goes from the north of Germany to Davos in Switzerland to see his cousin. He's to stay for 3 weeks, and he stays for 3 years. Stays for 7 years. Sorry, he's to go for 3 weeks, he stays for 7 years. So those 7 years become the big theme of the book, Magic Mountain, which is all about how time passes, how habits form, and how much debate there is about the future of the universe in this sanatorium, and indeed how much petty gossip there is too. Unfortunately, the letters she wrote to him from Davos, which became the source for the gossip part of the Magic Mountain, are lost. They were lost in the Second World War. But I mean, one of the problems, you can just imagine anyone who ever goes into a hospital, you always wonder if you're walking on the corridor to visit someone, that some doctor is going to say, have you been examined? That you could be brought into a bed. Anyway, this is what happens to his hero, Hans Castorp. They start looking at his lungs. So this is what happened when Thomas Mann goes to visit his wife. And out of this very short visit, he got that very long novel. The doctor in charge stopped each time he saw Thomas and Katia on the corridor. He made them understand that while he had read Thomas's books, Katia was the main focus of his attention. One day, however, having quickly assured Katia that he was thinking of her case, he turned to Thomas, moving him into the light, looking carefully at the whites of his eyes. "Have you been examined by one of the doctors?" he asked. I am not a patient," Thomas replied. "It might be wise to use your time here fruitfully," he said, and taking Thomas in suspiciously, he departed. When he made an appointment for Thomas in the clinic, he did not alert him, merely sent 2 orderlies to his room during the morning rest. The instructions were, they said, to take him to the clinic. When he intimated that he would need to let his wife know where he was going, they said his wife's rest could not be disturbed. In the clinic, the doctor ordered Thomas to take off his jacket, his shirt, and vest. He felt exposed and older than his years. He was left waiting for some time before the doctor returned, and without saying a word, set to examining his back, thumping it with his fist, listening to the sound, placing his other hand tenderly on the small of the back. He kept returning to certain spots, one near the left collarbone and one a little below it. They called a colleague over and told Thomas to breathe deeply and then cough. I mean, things haven't changed. And they started to move a stethoscope up and down his back, listening to the pressures within. By the slow, intent way they examined him, Thomas knew that they would have much to say when they had finished. "Just as I thought," one of them said. Thomas wished he were back in his room, having convinced the 2 orderlies that he was too busy to come with them. I'm afraid you are not simply a visitor here," the other one said. "I guessed that as soon as you arrived. It may turn out to be very lucky you came here." Thomas fetched his shirt. He wanted to cover himself. "You have a problem with one of your lungs. If it is not treated now, I can assure you that you will be back here within a few months." "What sort of treatment?" "The same as the other patients here. It will take time." "How long?" That is what they all ask. But soon they tire of asking, and they know how difficult it is to answer. "Are you sure about your diagnosis? Is it not too much of a coincidence that I was diagnosed here and not elsewhere?" The air up here," the senior doctor said, "is good for fighting off illness, but it is also good for letting illness emerge. It causes latent illness to erupt. Now you must go to bed. Soon we will take an interior picture of you." It was the X-ray that woke him from the dream that Davos had induced. He was told one morning that he would be taken to the laboratory in the basement that afternoon. When he asked Katia about it, she said it was nothing. It was merely a way for the doctors to get a clearer image of his chest and lungs. In a small room, As he waited, he was joined by a tall Swede. In the confined space, he found himself paying the Swede more attention than he'd paid anyone since he came here. He thought about the X-ray penetrating the man's skin, finding areas within him that no one would ever touch or see. When one of the technical assistants came out and instructed them both to strip to the waist, Thomas felt embarrassed and was almost prepared to ask if he could strip to the waist later, when the Swede had already gone into the X-ray room. But instead, hesitantly, he complied. By the time he'd removed his shirt, the Swede, having turned away from him, had already taken off his vest. His skin, in the dim light, was smooth and golden. The muscles on his back were fully developed. It struck Thomas in these few seconds that it would be natural, since the space was so small, to brush up against his companion, let his arms linger casually on the man's bare back. Before he could dismiss this idea, the Swede turned and unapologetically put his thumb and forefinger on the biceps of Thomas's right arm to measure his strength. He smiled boyishly and shrugged and indicated the muscles in his own upper arms, and then slapped himself gently on the stomach to make clear that he'd put on too much weight. In the inner room, the doctor was standing in front of a cabinet. As his eyes gradually got used to the light in the darkened room, Thomas saw a camera-like box on a rolling stand and rows of glass photographic plates set along the walls. He could also make out glassware and switch boxes and tall vertical gauges. This could, he thought, be a photographer's studio, a darkroom, an inventor's workshop, or a sorcerer's laboratory. Can you both... So soon a senior doctor appeared. "Can you both keep all screams of pain to a minimum?" he asked. There was laughter. They haven't changed, you know. There was laughter all, as a doctor's joke. There was laughter all around. "Would you like to see some of our handiwork?" he said. He flipped a switch to illustrate a set of plates that revealed ghostly body parts: hands, feet, knees, thighs, arms, pelvises, all phantom-like and hazy. The X-ray machine had peeled the flesh and muscle away, and pushing through what was soft had focused on the core, what the body would look like once the flesh had begun to rot. As Thomas held his breath, letting the eyes roam up and down the inner parts of someone whom he must pass regularly on the corridor, he found that he was leaning against the Swede, his shoulders touching the man's upper arm. The doctor determined that the Swede should go first. He was put in a sitting position facing the camera, his chest against a metal plate, his legs wide apart. The assistant pushed his shoulders forward and massaged his back in a series of kneading motions. He told the Swede to take a deep breath and hold it. And then the appropriate switch was turned. The Swede, Thomas could see, kept his eyes closed. The gauges sizzled with blue light, and sparks crackled along the wall. A red light blinked. Then everything became calm. It was now Thomas's turn. "Hug the panel," the doctor said. "Imagine it's someone else, someone you like, and press your chest against the other person and breathe in deeply." When it was over, the doctor told him and the Swede to wait. They would soon be able to see what the camera had captured. First, they would look at the Swede. In the image of the Swede held up against the light, Thomas saw the breastbone merged with the spine. That was one dark, grisly column. And then his eyes were drawn to something near the breastbone that looked like a sack. "Do you see his heart?" the doctor asked. When it was Thomas's turn to see himself, he felt he'd entered an inner sanctum in a holy place. As the screen was illuminated, he thought for a second of his father's body, now reduced to a skeleton in the graveyard in Lübeck. Then he saw his own body as it would be in the grave. He wondered if among the photographic plates they had images of Katia, images that might make her more precious to him once he had seen what she would look like in the great eternity. In a flash, he saw what this could do in a book. How dramatic it would be the first time a novelist described an X-ray, with all the eerie light and uncanny sounds, the result, an image that heretofore had been shared with no one. He had been enticed to Davos, he saw, as if by magic. As soon as he freed himself from its atmosphere, he would, he knew, start to work again. He longed to be back in his study now, ready to complain should one of the children make a sound. He listened respectfully to the doctor, who told him that the X-ray had confirmed what they already suspected. He was tubercular and he needed treatment. He nodded politely and meekly, suggesting that he was ready to put himself in the doctor's hands. But in his mind, he was already on the train going down the narrow rails that had been cut into the Alps. So this is 1913. No one imagines what's coming, least of all Thomas Mann. And so in the First World War, he will become a sort of Prussian militarist. He will be fired up with patriotism. Some of the remarks he made are quite close to remarks Patrick Pearse made in Ireland about bloodshed and the need for bloodshed as a cleansing tool on the battlefields of Europe. By the end of the war, he is ashamed of what he's done. Certainly by 1920, 21, 22, he has moved from being a monarchist to being a democrat, and partly with his wife's guidance in this. And of course, the Manns he's making a lot of money with this book, Buddenbrooks, all over the world. And during the German inflation, he has money. And there's a moment comes in his mind later that when they went to the opera, Thomas and his wife, in Munich, their chauffeur was waiting outside. There was an ostentatious sort of wealth about the two of them. Her fur coat, the chauffeur waiting in the lobby of the opera house, her fur coat, his cape, and their beautiful car outside. And he wondered if in one of those nights there were so many of the people who were being deeply affected by the inflation, so many opera lovers who couldn't afford opera tickets. And of course, among those people in Munich in those years who could not afford an opera ticket, who was an opera lover, who had no money, of course, was Adolf Hitler. And he wondered if on one of those nights that Hitler had been in that crowd. And of course, he didn't ever believe that Hitler would come to power, as people like me didn't believe that Donald Trump could ever come to power. And so the rise of Hitler really surprised him. And he became very quickly, because it wasn't just his wife's Jewishness, it was his own eminence, and it was his own sort of growing feeling that he represented something important in Germany, that he became a sort of an implacable enemy of the Nazis. So that he won the Nobel Prize in 1929. By 1933, he's out of the country. He's in Switzerland when Hitler takes power. The children warn him, do not dream of coming back into Munich. And so he begins his exile. And his exile takes him to Switzerland, then to France, and then to Princeton. And he becomes close to Roosevelt, who trusts him as somebody who can speak from the sort of middle ground of Germany in a way that Roosevelt cannot trust any other of the German exiles. And Thomas Mann, what he wants in reply, what he wants in return, is to get each of his 6 children out of Europe into America with visas, to get his brother Heinrich and Heinrich's wife out of Germany with visas. I mean, out of France or Germany or wherever they are in Europe, just to get them out of the country, which he manages to do. So he builds a house in Southern California, which the German government has recently bought, and it's been restored. His piano has been returned, some of his books. And in this house, he decides, one of the problems he has is that he was listening to the same music as Hitler. That the Wagner that he loved was the Wagner Hitler loved. And that this 19th century symphonic music had become, for him, really nourishing and inspiring. It had filled his imagination. But for somebody else, it had become really poisonous. And he wondered how you could reconcile that, how you could live with that. And of course, one of the ways of living with it was to say, well, perhaps the chamber music. Jeff was talking about late Beethoven. Perhaps those string quartets Beethoven wrote at the end of his life, especially a string quartet, Opus 132. And one of his sons has become a viola player, Michael. And Michael has a string quartet now in Los Angeles. And he asks Michael, who's a grumpy enough fellow, if he would get his string quartet to come to the house. And again, going into those rooms, the first time I went was 2005, into those rooms, to see, just to see how opulent the rooms were, how his study was away from the domestic space, but how easy it would be for a string quartet to set up and enough people to be able to watch them play. So they play Opus 132 for him. And the 4 young men, I'll go a bit later. When the music began, Thomas was struck by its daring, the quiet release of a sort of anguish, followed by a tone that suggested struggle. He must, he knew, stop thinking, give up trying to find simple meaning in the music, but instead let it enter his spirit, listen to it as though he might never get another chance. It was hard not to look at the players, however, and not to study their seriousness and concentration. Thomas watched them taking their cues from the lead violinist. The lead violinist and Michael, Thomas's son, on the viola, seemed to spar, taking energy from each other. The music edged towards resolution and held back for a moment before it soared. He glanced over at Katia, who smiled at him. This was the world of her parents, who had hosted so many such chamber concerts in their house in Munich. Out of this old world from which they had been forced to flee, Michael had emerged as the one with musical talent. Thomas watched him playing with slow care, showing no emotion. As handsome and self-possessed, he let the viola's dark sound hit against the sweeter sound of the two violins. As the music continued, the lead violinist and the cellist shed some of their Americanness. The rangy, friendly, masculine openness apparent earlier was replaced, he saw, by vulnerability, sensitivity, until they could have been Germans or Hungarians from decades before. Maybe he thought it was merely something he imagined, something caused by the force of the four instruments playing together as they found moments of pure connection with each other and then went silent or played solo. But Thomas could entertain the idea that ghosts from an earlier time, ghosts who had once walked the streets of the European cities carrying instruments, ghosts on their way to rehearsal, were present here in this new house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. In these years, Thomas Mann became an important figure in the public life of America. He toured America, making speeches in his faltering English called The Coming Victory of Democracy, and where he talked not about the need to defeat Hitler, but a need for another sort of Germany, the one that he represented, to dominate, to move into position once the war was over. He got as many as 5,000 people to come to hear him in places like Oklahoma, Ohio, and he did this with Roosevelt's blessing. There was no Japanese author doing this. There was no Italian author doing this. The idea of a German touring America with the president's blessing, I think, meant a lot for what happened after the war. At one moment, Roosevelt thought that Thomas Mann could become the president of a new Germany once Germany was defeated. Germany was defeated, and Thomas Mann, the problem was, everyone wanted him to come back to Germany, and he didn't want to return. And so he eventually goes back in 1949, and of course Germany is now divided. And the Americans do not want him to go into the East. And he says, you know, I live in the language. Germany is my language. The language is not divided. And the Americans couldn't believe that he was going to do this. And of course, he was going to go to Weimar, which of course is also Buchenwald. It was the place where Goethe wrote his poem, but it was also a place of a concentration camp. And one night he comes back from an event, and he's been in Frankfurt, and he meets the American who's following him everywhere, who's shadowing him, and has been shadowing him for some time. It is years since we met, the man said. I am Alan Bird. We met in Washington. Thomas remembered his name, and he remembered being suspicious of him even then. Bird indicated to Thomas that he should sit down. He made a sign that he closed the door behind him. Thomas was intrigued by his air of pure intent. Bird was, he thought, like a hungry hound. He resolved to speak as little as possible. My mission, Bird said, is simple. I represent the US government. I'm here to tell you we do not wish you to travel to the Eastern Zone. Thomas nodded and smiled. Bird opened the door quickly, checking there was no one on the other side before closing it. When he turned back to Thomas, he moved from English into fluent German, with some minor mistakes in pronunciation, but otherwise faultless. He began to speak as though from a script. Relations between us and the Soviets are deteriorating. Events like this evening and your visit to Munich are helpful for us. One step over the border, however, will be a propaganda coup for them. It will be reported all over the world. Thomas nodded again. Can I take it that this is understood? Bird asked. Thomas did not reply. I saw a delegation from the East there this evening, Bird went on. A grim bunch they are. From our side, the best thing would be a press conference in the morning saying that you will not go into the East until it is free, with free elections, a free press, freedom of movement, and no political prisoners. Thomas still said nothing. I need your assent, Bird said. I'm an American citizen, Thomas said. I believe in many freedoms, including my own freedom to visit my own country. The Eastern Zone is not your own country. Thomas folded his arms and smiled. While an American citizen, I remain a German writer, faithful to the German language, which is my true home. There are many words in the language people in the East cannot say. If I visit, I will say what I please. There are no restrictions. Oh, don't be naive. Everything that happens, if you cross that border, will be restricted. Are you attempting to restrict me? I'm talking sense to you. I represent a country that rescued you and your family from fascism. Goethe was born here in Frankfurt, but he lived his life in Weimar. I have no interest in whether Weimar is east or west. Weimar is Buchenwald. That is what Weimar is. And is Munich Dachau? Is every German town and city so tainted? Can I not reclaim the word Weimar, give it back to the language as belonging to Goethe? Buchenwald is not empty. It is where the communists now have their prisoners, thousands of them. Will you pass the camp by with your gaze averted? Is that what Goethe would have done? What do you know about Goethe? I know that he would not want to be associated with Buchenwald. Thomas did not reply. We don't want you to go, Bert continued. If you go, you will find America a cold place on your return. Are you threatening me? Thomas asked. They stared at one another with open hostility. I will be in Munich for your speech, Bert said as he turned to leave. Maybe you will have come to your senses by the time I see you there. You are keeping a watch on me then. After Einstein, you are the most important German alive. It would be negligent of us not to know what you are doing. And this next bit is where Thomas goes to a dinner in Munich. I think it's the bit that has really caused offense in Germany, but what can you do? So the dinner starts. He'd expected a new Germany to arise in which a dinner like this would be attended by a new generation nervously ready to recreate democracy. But everyone in the banqueting hall, this is in Munich, this is Munich 1949, looked to him middle-aged and overfed as well as jolly and at home. The more wine and beer consumed, the louder the voices grew and the more feverish the laughter. We will be forced, his companion said, to shake fleshy hands that not long ago were sticky with blood. The more soup was served, followed by some kind of fish. Then there was several meat courses, including platters of pork and roast beef. He watched as the men around him, the figures who held power in Munich now, took advantage of each course. The man opposite him, calling hungrily for more gravy to be poured over his beef. Since the man on his left, some kind of high official, did not say anything of any interest when they first spoke, Thomas saw no reason why he should engage him further. He simply sat in his place, picking at his food, as more and more platters came. He thought of the Munich he had known, the city of young artists and writers and impassioned debates in cafes at night, the city of Katya's parents, who was so open to high eccentricity as much as to high culture. In that old world, everyone was famous. The poet who published in a stray magazine was famous for his verse, as the artist who had made some woodcuts was pointed out in the street. Munich was a city in which there was a rumor about everyone. It was a metropolis that had become more socially engaged and sexually careless when inflation rose and money ceased to be solid. Money, he thought, was solid here in this hall, as dessert was served with waiters carrying huge vats of cream to cover pies and tarts. He suddenly realized where he was. Rather than the Munich of delicate souls and exalted social textures, this was the coarseness of the Bavarian village come into the city. The guests were so comfortable here that after a while, no one paid him too much attention. The guest of honor. He studied their mouths opening in raw laughter, the swagger in their gestures, the uncouth, thick-set way they dealt with each other. They and their kind would prevail, he thought. He could talk about Goethe all he pleased, but this was the future. And later on he says to the man, get me out of this country as soon as you possibly can, and he doesn't go back to live in Germany. At the very end of his life, he was honored in Lübeck. And so it all comes round again, back to Lübeck. And one of the things that I became interested in Lübeck, because I started spending time there, was that every time I went to any of the churches, they were always playing music by a composer called Buxtehude. Buxtehude. Now I have to say, his organ music seems to me to be the most boring organ music I've ever heard. If you really want to listen to it, please feel free. But there's one extraordinarily beautiful piece he wrote. It's for a choir, and it's called Membra Nostra Jesu. And it just takes you through all of the parts of Jesus' body as he's been crucified. And it's just the most beautiful piece of choral writing. So I became interested in this Buxtehude, and one day I really stupidly asked somebody, where's Buxtehude's grave? And you get that sort of funny silence. Any place, any of those contested places in the world, if you ask this stupid question. Of course, the grave, he died in 1707, and he was buried right in the middle of the city. But of course, in the Allied bombing of Lubeck, which was really intense, the grave was completely destroyed. I mean, he turned to dust, really to dust. I mean, there was no evidence at all that there ever had been anyone buried there. So the person I asked just didn't reply, just didn't say anything. And the original house, the original Buddenbrooks house, the house where the Mann family had been traders, has been restored. And the church they went to is still working. But anyway, he's back, and he's staying in a place called Travemünde, and he's thinking about. He goes to church in the morning. He leaves his wife, Katia, behind in their hotel. It's about 10 miles away in Travemünde, and goes into the city. He was pleased he had taken a corner table since the cafe was filling up. And he was happy, too, that no one among the Sunday morning crowd recognized him. A story came to him. It must have been told by his mother often when they were children. It was never referred to again, certainly not in Munich. It was a story about Buxtehude's daughter. Each year, the story went, when the young organist came, including Handel himself, to learn the secrets of his trade from Buxtehude, Buxtehude promised each one that he would tell him enough to make him the greatest composer in the world if he agreed to marry his youngest daughter, Anna Margareta. But even though his daughter was beautiful and accomplished, all the visitors refused, since all of them had romantic commitments at home, and therefore they left without learning the secret. And then, as a suitor was finally found for his daughter, a suitor who had no interest in music, Buxtehude was afraid that he would die and the secret would be lost to the world. Little did he know that a very young composer in Armstadt had heard about him and decided to walk all the way to Lubeck to see if he could discover the secret. Thomas paid his bill and walked down towards his grandmother's house. He could see his two sisters now waiting for the rest of the story, both of them in their night attire, and he could see his brother Heinrich sitting apart from them. And always in the story, their mother would sigh and say she had work to do and would continue the story tomorrow. And they would appeal to her, beg her to finish the story, and she always would. The young composer's name was Johann Sebastian Bach, she said, and he walked to Lubeck through wind and rain. Often he could find no boarding house, and he had to sleep in haystacks or in fields. Often he was hungry. Very often he was cold. But he was always sure of his purpose. If he could get to Lubeck, he would meet a man who would help him to become a great composer. Buxtehude was almost in despair. Some days he really believed that his sacred knowledge would be buried with him. On other days, in his heart, he knew that someone would come, and he dreamed that he would recognize the man immediately, and he would take him to the church, and he would share his secrets with him. How would he recognize the man? Heinrich asked. The man would have light in his eyes or something special in his voice, his mother said. How could he be sure? Heinrich asked. Wait. He is still on his journey and he is worried, Julia went on. Every day the walk seems longer. He has told the man he works for that he will be away only a short time. He does not realize how far Lubeck is, but he does not turn back. He walks on and on, asking all the time how far Lubeck is. But it is so far that some people he meets have never even heard of Lubeck, and they advise him to turn back. But he is determined not to, and eventually, when he reaches Lüneburg, he is told that he is not far from Lubeck, and the fame of Buxtehude has spread to there. But because of all his time on the road, poor Bach, normally so handsome, looks like a tramp. He knows that Buxtehude will never receive a man as badly dressed as he is. But he is lucky. A woman in Lüneburg, when she learns of Bach's plight, offers to lend him the clothes. She has seen the light in him. And so Bach arrives in Lubeck. And when he asks for Buxtehude, he is told that he will be in the Marienkirche practicing the organ. And as soon as Bach steps into the church, Buxtehude senses that he's no longer alone. He stops playing and looks down from the gallery and sees Bach, and behind him he sees the light. The light Bach has carried with him all the way, something glowing in his spirit, and he knows that this is the man to whom he can tell the secret. "What is the secret?" Thomas asked. "If I tell you, will you promise to go to bed?" Yeah. "It is called beauty," his mother said. "The secret is called beauty." He told him not to be afraid to put beauty into his music. And then for weeks and weeks and weeks, Buxtehude showed him how to do that. "Did Bach ever give the woman back the clothes?" Thomas asked. "Yes, he did. On his way home, and on her piano he played music for her that she thought came from heaven." Some windows Thomas saw in the old family house, the house of Buddenbrooks, were boarded up. The mayor had promised that the whole building would soon be restored. Lübeck, it appeared, was proud of it now, the house that had given life to a book. Thomas, as he stood in front of it, wished he could ask one of the others, his siblings, Heinrich, Lula, Carla, Victor, if they too remembered that story about Buxtehude and Bach. It had not come into his mind for years. Maybe there were other stories that he would remember, long forgotten ones, that he'd heard in the company of the others who had also lived in this house and who had now moved out of time towards a realm whose boundaries were still unclear to him. He glanced at the house again and walked through the city towards the car that would take him back to Travemünde, where Katja would be waiting for him. Thank you. So I probably put a damper on the whole evening, but if anyone has any, I think there's a microphone, isn't there? There's a microphone, so, or you can just shout or something, but if anyone has anything, even, I mean, it needn't be a question, just anything at all to say, really.
Do you remember when you went from journalism to literature? I think I remember meeting you at Le Stole in a certain bar. Do you remember? You just had, was it the Burning Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to, you know, everyone when I was a journalist was writing a novel or about to write a novel. And everybody was laughing at everybody for this. You know, in other words, how's the novel going? You would say to someone on a Monday morning when there was serious journalist work to be done. And, you know, out of that world, for example, I was working with Jean Kerrigan, who later became a great crime novelist, and we would often talk about it, you know, but hushed tone so that no one else would. Like, we didn't want Vincent Brown to know what we were doing, because we were meant to be thinking only about bringing down the government, Charlie Haughey's finances, you know, the arms trial, you know, Garrett, it just went on. And so it became a dream. It became something that I would scratch at the weekend or try and get nights, you know, and eventually realized that I'd better do this. And the problem is always, I think it's for anywhere, when I managed to, you know, just stop working as a journalist and had every day free, I just sat there. It was a bad summer. You know, those drizzly summers in Dublin where you just look, or anywhere in Ireland, where you just think it's going to clear up later, and then it doesn't, you know. And so eventually I just had to, you know, say, well, if I don't do this, no one else is going to do it. And so I finished the first novel in that way. But it was a big change from, I mean, journalism is so social. It's so quick. And it's so great because you get to see something you've been doing the next day, and you see if it's working. And also you're working with colleagues all the time. You're very close to editors, sub-editors, you know, people typesetting. You're in the world. You can touch the page. And the novel, when I realized first, when my first novel was accepted by a publisher, it was Christmas. So I thought, that's great, it'll be out. And they said, no, it will take us 18 months. You go, what? What are you going to do during the 18 months? But actually, that was what it was. It was a full. I was a year and a half in Dublin where I was about to publish a novel for the whole time. And I remember saying, how's the novel? Like, is that novel of yours still, you know? And so that was the big change from, you know, it just took a lot of determination. Yeah. Anybody else?
Why Thomas Mann?
It starts with love, I think, where, you know, when I was 19 or 20, I was reading, it was The Magic Mountain, strangely, was a very fashionable book in my world, as were, say, Bergman films, say, you know. And so I read the novels, most of them, in a few years. I think those years, what you read at that time, tends to stay with you or imprint itself on you in ways that maybe reading later doesn't as much. And so when I read those novels, say by Thomas Mann, or the novels by Henry James, I thought that a writer's name suggested solidity, stability, entitlement, confidence, and that, you know, to be a writer, that it came from a sort of strength in the self. Well, that turned out not to be true. And we know it turned out not to be true because Thomas Mann arranged in his will that his diaries were to be published after his death, and they were published 20 years after his death. And his diaries really make clear, first of all, that his erotic dreams were homosexual, but that was a small thing compared to the general unease he feels in the world. His nightly inability to sleep, his worry about social encounters, his uncertainty about his own politics, and that he was a guilty creature in certain ways, and that changed everything. And his wife, who was still alive when the diaries came out, didn't bother her for a moment that he was homeless. I mean, she published a little memoir, which really makes clear how liberal they were, how tolerant they were, how those early years of the 20th century in Germany were really great flowering of tolerance, new ideas. And so all of my impression of him from the novels changed. And so that was a fascinating idea of watching the interior life of someone in their diaries and in her memoir. And so I began to think, at first about a much smaller book, but then I realized that you really have to go through all the death of the father, the First World War, the Munich Revolution, the inflation, the rise of Hitler, that all of it has to come as a surprise to him. I suppose my idea was that if you were to write a biography, your job would be to give the information to the reader, so the reader would really be able to know about those things I've just described and take information from the diaries. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to create an illusion, to do what a novelist does, so that you enter into the room when he's in the room. You enter into his mind as he's watching, and you notice what he notices, you remember what he remembers, and you feel what he feels. So the theory of this would be that you should actually become him in a certain way, or see the world from his position. So the whole idea is to create illusion for the reader. And so that, it's emphatically not a biography, that it is a way of seeing if you could get the reader to move into this space. So that I imagine him, I describe things from his perspective. The only point of view in the book is his point of view. So that you should, at some point, begin to see the world from his point of view. And that's the theory of it. I mean, whether you succeed or not is another matter, but that's what I was trying to do.
Have you any indication as to why he didn't see the rise of Hitler, or didn't believe that it would happen?
That I think he was obtuse in certain ways, and he was so involved with himself. He had no peer group. It's not as though he knew other writers or had close friends among, intellectuals in Munich. He lived domestically, and he worked solidly in his study. He was a very famous man by that time, and it's his son, his third child, his second son Golo, who later became an historian. He was the one who kept pointing out to him, this is serious. Okay, they're not doing well in elections, but there's something going on. But he didn't think it possible for really good reasons, in that Hitler just seemed to be a piece of scum. And the people he was gathering around him were sort of nobodies. So there were many people who, up to 1929, were still not seeing it coming. If they had seen it coming, they might have prevented it. So he wasn't alone in not seeing it. But it reads remarkably sometimes when you see something, a letter he's writing or something he's doing, he doesn't know, he doesn't see it. And all of us know with Trump, there was a time when he seemed like an immense buffoon, as did the other fellow. The fact, but Trump even more, it just seemed, how would he get nominated? How would he win? And so it's almost as though we don't see these things because they just seem so unlikely. And then by the time we've seen them, they're there, they're solid, and they're in power.
Can I ask you a question about Laura Webster? Really loved it, and I loved the character. And it's about how you imagine yourself into someone else's lived experience, because I could relate to her, to her, and how you thought your way into that.
I was there in the room, that it's very close to autobiography, except that it's very hard, it really is hard, to write a novel, a full novel, from the point of view of a 12-year-old. So when I see someone like Claire Keegan doing that in Foster, I think, wow, I wish I'd known it could be done, but I probably can't do it. So my father died when I was 12, and myself and my younger brother were in the house of my mother, just the three of us, for the next few years. And I began to watch her very closely. And I began to watch everything she was doing. I remembered everything she was saying. We sort of followed her with our eyes. And so in a way, the novel is just a way of gathering all that memory and trying again to create this illusion that you're in her mind. And by the time I wrote the book, there's an important part of the book in a way is the dedication at the beginning, which is to my mother and my brother, because both of them had died. And so I was the only one from that time who knew what had happened in that house. Not that anything big happened, but what happened was grief, and we didn't have that word then. There was no such thing as counselling. People felt children didn't feel what adults felt. There was all that missing. This is 1967. All that was missing. But there was a lot of intensity around being a widow. A widow in this small town being watched all the time by people for signs. Is she wearing a bright collar? Like, what is she, Yeah, the hair. I mean, also, it was a period, I don't know if anyone here remembers it, when women just went and got their hair dyed and came home as though it was okay. I mean, my mother did this. She was grey hair, and she arrived home with some funny chestnut color. And we kept looking at her, wondering, like, what else? Like, what was the next thing, But it was really like autumn coming in a forest, where suddenly everything has turned gold overnight, tree by tree by tree. So women really did. And it must be that some sort of dye arrived that every hairdresser had, and they were all trying it out on women. And there were words I've never heard since, like ash blonde. She's ash blonde. I said, ash blonde? I don't know what that even means, but it was a very much part of. I know everyone hates Charlie Haughey, but my mother remained loyal to him because he really did. He didn't just double the widow's pension; he backdated the increases. So if he did it in the budget, whenever the budget would be, he would backdate it to Christmas, which means you get, and it's a word I don't hear anymore. You get a lump sum would come. A check, a lump, there's going to be a lump sum. And of course, the lump sum would be glorious because it would mean that, things could be bought that were needed, or luxury things. So all that world is in that book.
Well, can I just say, you wrote motherhood really well in that book, I thought.
You see, I was watching her so carefully that
So I have children that age now, and it was spot on. It really was.
How long, including research, did it take you to the total amount of work to write on the book?
To write The Magician? I was saying that I started researching in 2005 by going to the house in California that he built. And then over all the years, I would go anywhere, if I could, to see any man thing. I would read any book that came out, and I was sort of plotting the book. And so really it was all that time, but I was doing other things, and then I had to just dedicate myself to just writing the thing. It's awful, the business of postponing, where, I'm not making this up, but I woke up one morning in Havana with a hangover, and a hangover in Havana is always awful because there's such bad rum in Cuba, and it's poisonous, and there's a band is always below your hotel window doing Buena Vista Social Club. doing over and over and over. And you're lying there thinking, I have to get up. This cannot go on. I remember one of those mornings thinking, why am I so lazy, so drunken, so stupid, and so just such a lout? And I remember lying in bed, going through everything and just thinking, and then I thought, I know, I'm going to write the Thomas Mann book. I'm going to go home, shut up, and write my book that I've been planning all these years. And that must have been about 2017, maybe. And that's what I did then. The Hangover was great. The Hangover was really helpful because it really made me, like, if I don't do something urgent, and that's what this book was.
Erica and Klaus, just a question about them. You talked earlier about high eccentricity, and the two of them were characters of high eccentricity. But their paths were extremely disparate. She took, I suppose, a circuitous journey. She came back to her parents. Her life is very much around them. But Klaus couldn't seem to get back there, even though he wanted to, and took a very dissolute route. Do we know any more about that? Because there was some mention about the father being distracted. So could we put some of his bad fate down to Thomas Mann being distracted?
I didn't read from every section of the book, but Thomas Mann's first two children were called Erica and Klaus. And in the 1920s, they became poster children for the New Germany. They were openly homosexual. They slept with whoever they liked. They said what they liked. They wore what they liked. And they came home regularly like drowned rats looking for money. And of course, their father is in his three-piece suit in his study. He never gets to have any fun. And they're having like wonderful time. They become almost more famous than their father. Klaus writes novels. Erica's an actress and a journalist. And so, you know, we have to be very careful about blaming parents. There's one of Thomas Mann's daughters, Elizabeth, who's the youngest daughter, says something absolutely marvelous that I think should be inscribed, I think should be up on walls. It says, after 30, no one has the right to blame their parents for anything. I think if only, you know, and so that it's very hard to talk about the word parenting because the word parenting didn't exist then. It really is a reasonably new word. And fathers in like 1905 were not, you know, hugging their kids, picking up their kids. There were servants to do that. So I think to talk about, but I think he was a problem in that he was so famous, that he was such a challenge for his son who also wanted to be a writer. And of course, the whole problem of sexuality, and then the problem of morphine, of course, once the drugs come into the picture. Thomas Mann would himself, the idea of taking anything, you know, he just was such a bourgeois figure. But the kids went everywhere, did everything, and including morphine. And I mean, some of it's really funny because Erica in the 30s became stateless, that her passport was running out, and the Germans certainly were not going to renew her passport. They really hated her because she was doing polemics against Hitler. And so she was at a party in Amsterdam, and she saw this little fellow who she heard was English and a writer and a homosexual. And she went straight over to him and said, now, she said, I presume she said this in German accent, now, I would like to marry you. So could we do that? And he said no, that he was called Christopher Isherwood, and he said no, that his mother wouldn't like it and his boyfriend wouldn't appreciate it either. But he had a friend in England who would do anything. And so they sent a telegram to W.H. Auden. They said, will you marry Erica Mann? And Auden wrote back, delighted. And Erica Mann she got her hair cut and she put on a beautiful suit and a tie, and she went to England and she married Auden. And that meant it made a huge difference to her life because she could work for the BBC then during the war. She was an English citizen. But it also meant, but with her brother, eventually, Klaus got into the American army. The problem they both had came in 1945, where nobody knew what to do with them. Germany didn't want people who had left and been in exile for all the years. Germans were feeling immensely sorry for themselves in 1945 and 46, and they didn't want people coming in and blaming them and reminding them of all the things they had done. Erica at one stage decided to get married to a man just to see what it was like, and she found this famous actor called Grungens, and she married him. Lasted about a week, but it was great. And she divorced him. And he became a famous actor for the Nazis. If the Nazis wanted one of the great German plays performed, Grungens was their star. After the war, he was arrested by the Russians and he was detained. But very quickly, he was released. And Klaus Mann was in Germany when he saw Grungens coming back out onto the stage. And he saw in the dark him getting a standing ovation. So he wrote home saying, what they won't do in the day, they'll do in the dark. And he was appalled by this. And his own book, Mephisto, which was a novel about Grungens, could not be published in Germany until the 60s. It became a famous film later on. So he was like down on his luck. He wasn't wanted in America. He had no particular profession. He was addicted to morphine. So it was 1947, 48, 49, and he was just wandering in the south of France, going back to America looking for money from his parents. In the same way as Erica, his sister, was completely defeated and just went to live with her parents and tried to become her father's secretary. So that the great promise they had shown in the 20s was utterly destroyed by not only the rise of Hitler, but by the end of the war, that they didn't have a cause anymore. And the world was changing. And so that was a great tragedy, in especially the life of Thomas Mann's wife, that these two eldest children that had been so brilliant were now sort of faded, and so it was a sort of disaster. So why don't I take one more question, and then we'll all go to the bar. Is there another question?
Yes. Yeah? What about, you talked about California and his house in California, so what was his intellectual milieu at that time? Like, whenever I think about that, I think of Brecht and Adorno and people like this, so what was that like?
Yeah. So Thomas Mann was in Princeton first when he went into exile in America. In 1938, he was in Princeton. In 1940, he moves to California. He moves to Los Angeles, where great numbers of the German exiles, especially the writers and composers, moved. Partly to do with Hollywood, although Thomas Mann had no interest in Hollywood. But they congregated there partly because of Hollywood, partly because of the good weather, and also because Los Angeles is a city made up of foreigners. It's filled with Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, Mexicans, and they didn't stand out as much as they did on the East Coast. But in any case, a great numbers of them arrived there. The composer Schoenberg was there, the philosopher Adorno, Bertolt Brecht was there, and infinite numbers of sort of much more minor figures. And of course, what they did was they fell out with each other. They had massive feuds because they were sort of locked into this bubble. So he had as little to do with them as he could. In other words, he was the one who had the beautiful house. While his brother, for example, had no income. He was depending on Thomas Mann's charity. Bertolt Brecht hated Thomas Mann. He just thought he was a bourgeois, and he just spent his time insulting him. So they would just glower at each other. And so there wasn't a milieu. It wasn't for him a milieu. For others of the Germans, they did meet together regularly. The Manns tended to stay apart. I mean, they had a closer relationship with their gardeners than they did with, Adorno. Well, Adorno came to visit because Thomas Mann needed to know about music, technical things. And the philosopher Adorno was a philosopher of music. And he taught him things. But, the big falling out came because Alma Mahler, Gustav Mahler's widow, she marries Walter Gropius, the architect. Then she marries Franz Werfel. She gets out of the south of France in 1940. She has 23 suitcases. She has a white dress that she has to go over the Pyrenees, and Golo Mann, Thomas Mann's son, is with her, says, it looked like a flag of surrender. It could be seen for miles away. She did every single thing to get them detained. But they made their way to America. She just caused trouble all the time. And she discovered, Thomas Mann wrote a novel, one of the last big novels called Dr. Faustus, in which he really included the sort of system, 12-tone system that the composer Schoenberg, who was living nearby, had invented. He also made his character syphilis. He gave him syphilis. I mean, he used Schoenberg's music. It could only have been Schoenberg. But he gave his character syphilis. It's a big issue for a novelist. Can you do that? So Schoenberg went into a rage, helped by Alma Mahler, and he met a German woman in the supermarket in Brentwood and said, I do not have syphilis. no one said, no, but nobody thinks, yeah, everybody thinks I have syphilis. And because of Thomas Mann's book. And a huge controversy ensued with letters to the paper, and Schoenberg got him to put a note in to say that this novel is not Schoenberg. The protagonist, of course, no one had thought it was, so that suddenly now everyone's starting to think about it. And, just in case you think the world is a simple place, the reason we have all this, Dr. Faustus, Magic Mountain, all the books, is a woman called Helen Tracy Low-Porter, living in Princeton, translated all these books. And she is the great-grandmother of Boris Johnson. So I don't know what that says. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.